There's so many questions people have on halacha, chinuch, relationships, mental health, marriage, hashkafa, and everything in between. Every 2 weeks, I discuss them with senior dayanim of the Kehillas Federation. I'm Mena Reisner, and you're listening to Asking for a Friend. And welcome back to Asking for a Friend. This is now episode 17, and just before we begin today's discussion, I wanted to briefly thank everyone for the incredible response to our last episode on electric scooters. We've received feedback from around the world, from parents, Hatzalah members, and many concerned listeners. Particularly moving were the messages from parents whose own children had been injured, in some cases very seriously. And they told us that they hoped the episode would help spare other families from going through the same experience. It's clear that the conversation has helped raise awareness of just how dangerous the scooters can be. So thank you for sending in your feedback. If you've been enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you think others would benefit, we'd appreciate you sharing it with family and friends. Sponsorship opportunities are also available for future episodes. If you'd like to find out more, please email podcast@federation.org.uk. So now to today's episode. Until now, we've covered a very wide range of practical halachic topics, but today we're beginning our first journey into Choshen Mishpat, an area of halacha dealing with business, money, employment, and our obligations to one another in everyday financial dealings. It's a fascinating area that we'll be returning to many times in future episodes, Mitzvah. Today we're discussing two very closely related concepts, oni mehapech, which broadly speaking means that it's prohibited to interfere with an opportunity someone else is already pursuing, and Hasagas gevul, the halachos governing when competition or business activity crosses the line into unfairly harming another person's parnassa. These questions arise far more often than many people realize. Whether you're an employee, employer, a business owner, a fundraiser, professional, these halachos have many, many practical applications in everyday life. Joining us once again to guide us through this very fascinating topic is Dayan Posen. Thank you for recording with us today.
Pleasure.
So Dayan Posen, I'd like to start this episode a bit differently than normal, perhaps in order to make these halachos more real for the listeners, and many of our listeners might not have heard of these concepts before. So could you begin by painting a picture or scenario, a shaila, which is common, which is everyday, in which these halachos could or would apply?
Sure. So let's discuss a scenario in which Reuven's been working for Shimon for 10 years. And when he brought him in, he knew nothing about the business. But as time progresses, Reuven gets more and more involved and he takes on more and more responsibilities. And as he does, Shimon recognizes that and increases his salary. But at this stage, Reuven feels that now he's more or less running the business himself, and he's actually growing a business which he has no part of, which he doesn't own at all. And he wants at this stage of his life to be building something for his family, and therefore he has turned to Shimon and kind of given him an ultimatum. Either let me become a shutzer for partner, or I'm going to leave and open up on my own, and a large proportion of the business will probably come with me. Shimon's responded that he's prepared to give him a 50% shutfus, a 50% partnership in the profits of his company, and Reuven's now come to ask whether he's better off accepting the offer or opening up on his own, seeing as he feels confident that he'll be able to take a lot of the business with him.
I mean, most people looking at it from Shimon, from the employer's perspective, would probably think that the employee Reuven is quite ungrateful. No, he practically built him up.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I come across this scenario where the employer hasn't acted in this manner and hasn't raised the salary at all. And therefore the employee feels, I've worked all these years with nothing to show for it. In this scenario that we're talking about, his salary has increased over time. And there's a dvar Torah which I often say over in these situations. The Pasuk tells us, "Vayoveh melech chodesh asher lo yoda es Yosef." When Klal Yisrael were in Mitzrayim, then a new king over Egypt came to pass, who didn't know Yosef, who didn't recognize all that Yosef had done for the good of the people of Mitzrayim, and acted harshly to Klal Yisrael, to the Jewish people. And Rashi brings a machlekes between Amoraim, whether in fact it was actually a new king, or was it the old king who made out as if he didn't know Yosef. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky asks, why are Amoraim arguing about a historical event that happened thousands of years before? Whether it was a new king, it wasn't a new king. The bottom line is, Asher lo yadas Yosef. He didn't know or didn't want to know Yosef. The kasha is not such a big kasha because you find many times in Shas that we have these kind of discussions, but the teretz is beautiful. Yaakov explains this is not machlokes about historical fact. It's machlokes in human nature. One Amoira holds that it's not possible to have a situation in which a person owes so much hakaras hatov to someone else, and one morning they wake up, ki'ilu lo haya, as if nothing's happened, I don't owe you anything, who are you bichlal? And therefore it must be it was a new king. And the other Amoira holds no, it's taka possible that one day a person can wake up and as if the history didn't happen, I don't owe you anything, kimnish gornish to you nothing, you're not entitled to anything, and you're like a stranger to me. And that's what's going on in the Gemara. Now, if that's pshat in the Gemara, then I'm passing like the second mandama, because we see this in Bezdin often, that as time evolves, circumstances evolve, people forget where they started out, how they got to where they are. And this scenario which we're talking about is not uncommon at all.
Right, but the way the employee framed that question, should I go on my own or will you make me a shutuf, is that question alone a level of blackmail, or is that considered regular business talk?
That's the point that I'm trying to bring out with that Torah. The employee now, as things stand, thinks he's paid back his boss tenfold. You don't owe me, I'm not an eved, I'm not a servant, I'm free to look after my own priorities. Let's be honest, you look after yours and I look after mine. You only paid me more, you'll probably think, because you wanted to keep me, which might be true. And now that I've reached where I am, I could be doing the same work I'm doing and getting 100% of the profit. So why shouldn't I leave?
So going back to the shayla you said, what are the angles of those two options?
Okay, so let's begin with the first option. It's very important to understand where Reuven's coming from. In his mind, like we said, he's paid back Shimon, and he's taken the business to a whole different level. Sometimes he's taken it down a path that was never dreamt of before. He might have completely revolutionized the business, opened up markets that didn't exist. And reflecting back on all that, he thinks, other than the salary I have, I've changed the value of my boss's business in a major way, but I've got nothing to show for it. And I want to do that at this stage of my life for myself. I want to build something for myself, for my family. And I don't want to just get a wage, even a nice wage, because I want to build something that has a future. And that's what's going on in his mind.
Okay, so would that mean that his first option of becoming a partner in the profits, would you suggest that as a good solution?
So I've, on a number of occasions, come across this particular scenario, and it's fascinating because the employee is looking for the magic word. He's looking for the word shutuf, for the word partner. He wants to own part of the company. He wants to be building something for himself. And I've seen on a number of occasions where the boss has recognized the need of the employee, and he's used this terminology, shutuf in the profits. You're a partner in the profits. And the employee's fallen for it. And in actual fact, sometimes I think that the boss has intentionally used that terminology to give them a false security. The Gemara in a number of places discusses the concept of a crop share. So the model was farmers would hire people to harvest their fields, and rather than pay them a fixed wage, they pay them an agreed percentage of the crop which they harvested. This arrangement doesn't make the person who's doing the harvesting, he's not a shutuf in the field, he's not a partner in the field. Rather, instead of receiving a fixed salary, so he gets a commission-only salary. So then, a number of practical halachic nafkaminas that differentiate. For example, if the boss was late to pay the commission, so if you recognize that this is actually just what he owes him for his wages, there'll be a issa d'oraisa baltalin in certain cases for paying late, because it's wages, it's not profit. As opposed to when it comes to partners, if a partner gives a dividend or gives his other partner share of the profits late, there's no baltalin, there's no issa. But more importantly here, Reuven would actually not be achieving what he's aiming for. He wants to build something that he owns, that when he brings value to the company, he's going to be gaining from that. In actual fact, as long as he's at the company, he might get a share of the profits. But for example, if the business would be sold, he wouldn't necessarily get anything. And more importantly, he hasn't actually got job security. If, let's say, one day his boss fired him, followed the correct procedure and whatever it is, he walks away with very little to show for it. So if in the scenario that we painted, what's important to him is he's building something, this is actually a smokescreen, this concept of partner in profits. Doesn't sound as good when you say it in English. When you say it in Lashon HaKodesh, you're a shutef in the profits. All of a sudden, you hear that shutef word and people fall for it, and it's a mistake.
So you're implying that there's no advantage in getting a share of the profits? You're looking at it like a regular wage increase?
No, not at all. He's getting a share of the profits. That often motivates him much more than a fixed salary would. He's incentivized to be matzliach, and the more atzlacha he has, the more he'll get paid. And furthermore, from the employee's point of view, if his entire wage is commission-based, and the employee isn't taking much of a risk by hiring him, because if he's matzliach, if he succeeds, he'll get paid more, and if he doesn't, he'll pay him less. It's also important to remember that the grass is always green on the other side. Employees always think that their bosses have the geschmack of life. They own a company. I wish one day I could own a company. And they don't realize that there's a huge amount of stress that comes with being the boss. The employee can go home after work hours, depending on your job, how much you have to look at your phone or don't look at your phone, or just look at your phone even if you don't have to. But at the end of the day, they don't have that same level of stress as the boss. At the end of the day, he's got to find money to pay the suppliers. He's got to find money to pay the wages. Or he might have tax bills outstanding. He's got huge, constant pressure. And often, remarkably, when all's said and done, I've come across on a number of occasions employees who are probably taking home more every year than the people who own the companies that they're working for. So, and with that fraction of the responsibility and the pressure and the headache. So you have to be careful what you wish for.
It's a very interesting point. I think employees sometimes look at an employer's day-to-day as possibly being more flexible. He could take a day off, or he could be more flexible with an appointment that he has to go to, but really doesn't realize that the boss is never sleeping sound. And when he's on holiday, then he has to be working as well. So I think he only sees his day-to-day life as being less flexible.
Yeah, he sees that as the ideal. And there's another point just to add, is that if an employee is receiving nice wages and commissions, there's nothing stopping him taking that extra money, and rather than living a higher lifestyle, investing that money in properties, for example. And that way he actually over time has, he can build up a property portfolio. Over time he's got something which is his, which helps his family's security. So the security that he's looking for doesn't have to come from the company that he thinks he's building. So to answer your question, that there can be a big advantage of getting paid, commission-based as well. But for some people, that doesn't do it. It's not enough.
Okay, so that would be very good advice to someone who's looking for a partnership. I think just to calm them down, make them understand that they haven't become a partner, understand that the position is still one of an employee, but it's a good incentive and there's more money to be made from the employee perspective. And the employer gets to only gain as his employee gets greater incentives. But can you explain the angle of the second option? The employee saying he's going to open on his own business, potentially taking the clients with him. What goes into that?
To be clear, every shayla like this has its own angles, each of which can change the psak. But generally, let's say, for example, if Reuven has an employment contract with Shimon, he may have a non-compete clause in his contract, which may prevent him from being able to work in this line of business for a period of time. When and if these non-complete clauses work halachically or legally is really a subject of its own. There may be a non-solicitation clause in the contract which would expressly forbid him from trying to poach the company's clients. But let's speak about the more common scenarios where there aren't such clauses in the contract at all, for the simple reason that there's no written contract. And these points were never discussed, were never thought about. When a person takes a job, they're not necessarily thinking about leaving the company. They're very happy that they've been employed. And as time passes, things change.
Would you say generally in the from working space, there's a large amount of people who are working without contracts at all?
In my experience in the from working space, as you call it, there's a large amount of people doing everything without contracts. It's no different when it comes to employment. It's no different when it even comes remarkably to investment. It's no different when it comes to partnerships. There's a certain trust or naivety, depending how you look at it, before you got burnt or after you got burnt, that people enter into things remarkably without anything written whatsoever, or something hardly written which can make matters better or worse, depending on the situation.
Right. Okay, so going back to our case, what would you consider to be his clients? Because we're discussing whether he can take his clients with him. How would you define his clients? Are they his? Are they the company's?
So that's a good question. People generally often make the mistake of thinking that they own their clients. Like they make the mistake of thinking their clients are going to stay with them forever. Sometimes we hear people discuss the value of their business, and they really talk about it as if they really think they own their clients, and this is an asset we have. Like some companies own property, we own clients. And of course, that's not the case. One doesn't own one's clients. Clients are free to choose to go elsewhere unless they're under contract. And therefore, if one were to take someone else's clients, then we're not going to be dealing with a strict issa of geneva in the same way as geneva, theft of something which a person owns an asset and I've taken that asset. So we're not strictly speaking about classic geneva deraisa. However, if a company has clients and one approaches those clients directly and asks them to bring their business to you instead of where they are now, then there'll be an issa of mehapech. And we're going to go into this issa and see regarding these clients that we're talking about, that you're asking, where might it be a problem, where might it not be a problem?
You're not just speaking about an employee or an ex-employee, you're speaking in general to approach someone else's clients.
Correct.
So what is the issa of Oniya Mehapech? Where does that come from?
So the issa begins in the Gemara in Kedushin, Daf Nun Tes, where the Gemara tells us a story. And in that story, similar to how we began, it's easier if you explain it, if you frame it in a story. Rav Gidl, the Gemara says, Rav Gidl have a mehapech by hi'ara. Rav Gidl was pursuing a piece of land, he wanted to acquire it. And also Rav Abba, Zavna, Rav Abba jumped in and he bought it. And Rav Gidl was very upset. They had been gezamt, and he went and complained to Rav Zera, the Rav Abba had gezamt him. And Rav Zera passed the matter up to Rav Yitzchak Nafka. And he said, wait till the next regel when Rav Abba will come and visit his Rebbe. And Rav Abba came, and Rav Yitzchak Nafka used a method which we find actually in Nach, when Nosson HaNovi wanted to rebuke David HaMelech. So he asked him what the halacha would be in a particular scenario which David HaMelech had no shaykhs to, no connection to. And David HaMelech took a very firm position, upon which Nosson HaNovi showed David HaMelech that question he'd asked him was actually the scenario that David HaMelech was himself experiencing and going through, and therefore really David had inadvertently paskened his own situation. Some Bali Musa say that when it comes to a person being ma'avar medoisov and not judging other people, being don l'chavschus, that the base yachmir, and we're going to judge our own actions in a similar approach, is a very powerful way of getting a person to look at things without that negias, but how would he look at it, how would he judge it? So similarly here, in this story, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka asked Rabbi Abba a generic shaila. He said to him, Oni mehapech b'charar, if you got a poor man who's running after a piece of bread, bo'ach ever not lahimenu, and someone else jumps in and snatches it, mai. What would you say in such a ethical shaila? What would you say in such a situation? And Rabbi Abba, without missing a beat, said, Nikra rasha. He's called a rasha, someone who does that. To which Yitzchak Nafka challenged Rabbi Abba, and he said, well, why did you do that? That's what you did with this land, with Rav Gidl, which Rav Gidl was looking for. And actually, Rabbi Abba replied that he had no idea that Rav Gidl was trying to buy this piece of land. And just interesting how the Gemara finishes that he was asked, would you sell this land to Rav Gidl? And in the time of the Gemara, people bought land and then they held on to it. They very rarely sold it unless there was a very good reason to sell it. This Yiddish concept of flipping properties wasn't so prevalent at the time of the Gemara. And he answered him that Rabbi Abba said, I can't sell it to him because it's the first piece of land I bought, and it's not a good simon if a person sells the first land he bought. So I can't sell it. But you know what? If you want, I can give it to him as a present. And the Gemara tells us that Rav Gidl wouldn't take it as a present because there's a pasuk that a person who takes gifts, it's not necessarily beneficial in the long run. So he wouldn't sell it to him. Rav Gidl wouldn't take it as a free gift. There was this standoff between the two of them where Reb Abba actually didn't even want to have it anymore because he'd inadvertently obtained it by gazumping Reb Gidl. Reb Gidl didn't want to take it as a gift. And the land was left as hefker for the Talmidim to benefit from this hefker land. So this Gemara is the source, is the makar for the halachos of oni mehapech b'chara, or what we call in English the issa of gazumping.
Is that issa min Torah? Is it a biblical prohibition, or is it midrabanon, or just not recommended?
So around 280 years ago, there was a sefer called Arad Rabbanon, which was written by Rabbi Sol Yaakov Al-Ghazi, lived in Constantinople, in which he discusses concepts like this around Shas, whether they're deiraisa, whether they're a Torah prohibition, or whether they're midivrei Kabbalah, or whether they're midrabanon. And he's not sure about this issa. Is it something which is awesome in Torah, from a Torah point of view, or only midrabanon? And this question of his is quoted in the Piskei Tshuva in his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. And he also quotes a Tshuva, the Marit, of Yosef Titrani, written about 400 years ago, in which he paskins that it's awesome midivrei Kabbalah, and he bases it on a pasuk in Yecheskel. More recently, the Sefer Mishpat Shalom and the Aruch HaShulchan, who are more recent poskim, they paskin that it's midivrei Kabbalah. There is actually a Tshuvas of Nezer where he says that no, it's actually only a issa midrabanan, not midivrei Kabbalah.
So going back to the Gemara, you said nikra rasha is called a wicked person if you transgress this oni mehapech b'chara. Practically, what does that mean? What does it mean that you're called a rasha?
So, believe it or not, the Sma in his Pirush and Shulchan Aruch explains that machrizne alav b'beis haknesses, literally you're meant to announce it and declare in shul, so-and-so is a rasha because he gazumped someone else.
That's why most people never heard that. It's being shouted out on Shabbos morning in their shul.
Yeah, so Sefer Masas Ben Yomin says that when a person is over, we publicly embarrass him, and therefore we don't give him the added punishment that he has to reverse the sale. In other words, he gazumped someone, he got it. Since we're punishing him once that we publicly embarrass him, we don't make him also reverse the sale. Shalom Mordechai Shvadron, the Marsham, was a grandfather of the famous Maggid called after him, who lived more in our generation. In his Sefer Mishpat Shalom, he says, since nowadays we don't declare in shul that he's a rasha, maybe we should force him to reverse the transaction. Originally, you call him a rasha, so you don't make him reverse the transaction. But nowadays, we don't call him a rasha. Now, Marsham was written in the late 19th century. So clearly, you can see already 100 years ago, they stopped publicly declaring Oni Mehapech as a rasha. I'm not sure why they stopped. I can actually think of a number of bin Adam l'chaveri surim, which if we started naming and shaming from the bimah, it might make people think twice about how they behave. But
there won't be much davening done.
Yeah, maybe that should be for a different podcast.
So going back to our original case, how would these halachos of Oni Mehapech, of snatching someone else's item that is due to him, how would they apply to our case of this employee leaving?
So in our case, the question of Oni Mehapech would be one of the areas that needs addressing when it comes to Reuven approaching directly Shimon's, the company's clients, and soliciting them to move their business to his company. So firstly, when a person is employed, if there's nothing that discusses this point in his contract, any client he brings to the company once he's already employed, and they weren't his clients before he came to the company, are considered to be clients of the company. Therefore, in this regard, there's no difference between what he calls his clients, if he means the ones he's brought to the firm since he's been at the firm, and other clients of the firm, nothing to do with him. However, there might well be a difference with regard to clients that he already had before he joined the company and he brought his, so to speak, Rolodex, as they used to call it, for those old enough to remember what that is. In such a case, it would probably be understood that if he were to leave, he could take the same clients he brought into the company, he can take with him. But this could well be industry sensitive, and the point here is more to speak in general terms. By the way, this distinction you often find in a completely different area when it comes to teachers. It can be quite a hot topic. We get shilas about this every now and then. If you have a teacher who creates a curriculum during school hours or outside school hours, but during hours that they're paid. So then the intellectual property rights, which maybe is a subject for a different podcast, the rights to that curriculum belong to the school and not the teacher. But if a teacher spends their own time creating a curriculum just to make it easier for them to teach, then that curriculum will belong to the teacher. So it's a bit off topic, but it's a similar concept where people sometimes have this misconception what they own, what's theirs, when actually they created it or assembled it during working hours when they were paid, and this is part of their job, and therefore actually doesn't belong to them, it belongs to the company. So to come back to our question, with regards to what we've classified as the company's clients, there'd be an issa of mehapech to directly approach them and try to get them to move over.
You say directly approach them, implying that there's a way it can be done indirectly, is that right?
Yeah. The mechaber in Choshen Mishpat, Zayin, see base, paskins, it's also lemelamed lahaske atzmi lebalabayis, sheyesh lemelamed achabe beisei. It's forbidden for a teacher, a rebbe, to hire himself to a parent. In those days, there was a lot more homeschooling than there is now, and let's hope it stays as it is now. A person used to hire a rebbe to teach their child, and it's forbidden for one rebbe to go to a parent and say, hire me instead of the rebbe which you currently have in your house. Unless the balabayis says, he lets it be known, I don't want to keep this rebbe, I'm looking for another rebbe. If he says I'm looking for another rebbe, then it's fine. So the Sma in Cheish Mishpat also explains this concept. There's no issa of oni mehapech if the client approaches you rather than you approach them. So therefore, on a practical level, everyone's free to advertise to the general public. And once the clients see the advert, in our scenario, if let's say Reuven says, I'm not staying in the company anymore, I'm leaving. So we've established it would be also for him to approach the clients of the company and say, come and work for me. If he goes and advertises, I'm now working, and everyone can, of course, all his friends can put an advert, wish him all the best, and etc., and everyone sees it. And then these clients say, well, I didn't know he's now working on his own. And they call him up and say, I've seen in the press that you're working on your own. Actually, I like you. You do my accounts or whatever it may be. I like your business. They can come to him. There's no problem with that.
Right. So you're saying because advertising is not considered directly approaching people. So if I were to put an advert on a street, on a wall, on a lamppost, it's as if I'm just standing on the street talking about the business and people can hear it.
Correct.
But there's also semi-direct ways of advertising. Of, let's say, if I were to put an advertisement in these local...
Many you sound like you know about advertising. Well, yeah.
Indeed. If you put an advert in one of the weekly circulars that get delivered, is that considered going into someone's house? Or is that still considered like advertising on the street?
So circulars is general press, and that's okay. Even though, again, not everyone necessarily has these circulars delivered to the house. Some people don't want them. They put up a sign, don't post, free post, whatever it is. But that's considered the general marketplace. That's no different than putting on the notice board in shul. But you're advertising to the general public. You're not targeting, you're not sending it to these people. You're putting in the press. Rather that goes. You put it in the newspaper, you put it in a magazine, you put it in the circular.
But directly messaging people is very different.
Yes.
And let's say something like WhatsApp status, which has become very common in the communities as a way of advertising. Would that be considered direct messaging or public?
It's a very good point. And the more one delves into these different shilas scenarios, the more you see it's a very, very thin line, very nuanced point. And I think there may well be certain areas which are a bit grey. So, for example, your point, I personally think that one will be allowed to have an advert on their status because the clients don't have to look at their status. And even if they look at status, they don't have to see this person's status and they can, swipe through it or whatever. They don't necessarily have to see it. But if, for example, you were to send it to all of your WhatsApp contacts or your phone contacts, and that means you're directly sending, and these clients are on your WhatsApp contacts, then you're sending an advert directly to them, which is a problem. So It's very subtle.
Right.
We mentioned earlier that there could be machlekes where there's ism drabonon or ism divrei kabbalah. So on drabonons, safek drabonon l'kula, there's more leeway once the line gets sufficiently blurred. One can be a bit more lenient than if it's divrei kabbalah, where sometimes one's more machmir, not always. But
another common angle in the scenario we discussed, if someone leaves the company and a boss could say, don't send an email to all our clients saying that you're leaving, because he doesn't want them to respond, so where are you going? And then that will inevitably lead to the I've opened my new company conversation. And let's say if that employee, if that Reuven thinks that it's almost a bit rude, I've been dealing with these people for 10 years, suddenly they're going to get a bounce back email, and I'm going to meet them in a few weeks, and he feels that he wants to send it, even if he doesn't have ulterior motives for poaching clients. What would the Dayan say to that?
So this does come up quite often. And bearing in mind that we've just made the distinction between whether you approach the clients or whether they approach you. And by the way, we sometimes have dinetera on this, where who approached who. Once came across a case where the person said the clients approached me, and he could show the email they approached him, and it came out in a different email chain for a different point of the dinetera that actually he'd sent in and said, okay, now send me a new email, approaching me. I fully understand the anxiety that a boss goes through, because it's so subtle that the moment they call you and come to you, you're okay, he'll be anxious that if you send them this email, it can potentially trigger them asking. And once they've asked, I'm okay. On the other hand, it is rude. You've worked with people, it just disappears if there's almost some scandal or something that it doesn't go down well. What we normally advise is that an email is sent out saying that it's been lovely working together. I'm no longer going to be at this company. And for all future work, please email with a new point of contact, and wish you all the best. And this email address will no longer be active. And press send, and then shut down the email address. And that way they can't contact him on the email address. Now, if they choose to phone him, then they choose to phone him. But let's be honest, if he disappeared in smoke all of a sudden without any explanation, they might choose to phone him as well. So that's the pshah which I normally would advise people. I understand both sides. You work with people for years, you can't just disappear. It's a problem.
What do you generally tell Jewish employers who are always concerned about a very successful Jewish employee coming in, fresh out yeshiva, with a great head, and there's so many reasons to hire someone and to support the community and to support local families, but with always the fear that there's a book of contacts that I have that he's going to very easily have access to, and the trust is very high amongst local people. So he's worried. He's just worried to employ someone, however good they are and however much he wants to help them. He's worried that he's just going to run off and do as he will. I'm sure the Dayan gets approached with this the whole time.
Yeah, this is a familiar problem. Of course, the mashgichim would remind us about the importance of having emunah and betochen and parnassa from the rabbeim shleilim. But at the same time, too many people know too many stories where these kind of things have happened and people's parnassas have been affected. And there are, in certain situations, certain shtoros, certain contracts which can be written. Not your standard non-compete, because they're very limited if they work, how they work, and to what level they work. But there are certain situations, certain shtoros which can be written that can create a genuine deterrence in a manner that works al pi halacha and legally. But again, not in all situations. The challenge is that people are looking for someone to employ who's geriben. I'm not sure how you translate geriben. Someone who's got their own ability to think out the box, to generate opportunities, someone looking for angles, and someone who's not just a robot, does what he's told, but someone who's got that extra, factor.
It's all the recipe.
Enables them. Yeah, and that is what makes them then be more likely to not just be in their comfort zone and think about, one minute I can go higher. So it's a catch-22. That's the
bottom line is, if going to a competent Dayan, the crew could write up a contract prior that can offer
only in some situations. It all depends on the nuances that are beyond tonight's share, but in some situations there are things that can be written, but not in all situations. In certain situations, there's nothing you can do.
You touched on before a rebbe or a melamed trying to get his colleague's job. What about the other way around? We're all familiar of cases where schools have poached a rebbe or teacher from another school. Would the Dayan say that's a problem of onia mehapech?
Well, in the Gemara in Kedushin, there's a well-known machlokes between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, who's quoted in Tosfos. And Rabbeinu Tam rules that the reason why the second person on the scene is restricted from gazumping his colleague is because his colleague was there first. And since the second person can go and buy this field or this item somewhere else, we say to him, why do you need to gazump the person who was there first, who's already more involved? However, says Rabbeinu Tam, that's only true with a sale or a rental, as opposed to something which is hefker, something which is got no owner at all, or something which is being offered as a gift, where one can't necessarily obtain it somewhere else. If you're running through the street and you see a £50 note on the floor, here in London the streets are not paved with gold, and you can't just say to him, if someone else sees your line of vision, they see where you're running, and all of a sudden they're actually nearer to it, and they wonder, can they jump in and pick up this £50 note? You can't say to the second person, well, I'll go and find a £50 note somewhere else, because you can't find them. In that situation, says Reuven, there's no problem at all, because ultimately the first person hadn't done any kinyan, hadn't done any acquisition. It's not yet his. So this high moral bar that the Gemara has created of not gazumping is only when one can say, because you can go elsewhere. But if one can't, then kind of first come, first served. Now Rashi, on the other hand, he doesn't agree with this, and Rashi holds it applies across the board in all situations. The mechaber in Shulchan Aruch in Cheish Mishpat brings both opinions, and the Ramah rules like the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam, and he actually takes that logic further, and he says even by a sale, even by a mekach, if the item being sold is considered like a metziah, it's considered hard to find, for example, due to a property's location or a property's price, that you can't tell me go and buy a house somewhere else. I've been looking to buy a house on this street near my parents or far from my in-laws or whatever it is, and I can't find, and now all of a sudden I find an opportunity to find. Don't tell me go somewhere else. Says the Ramah, the same thing would apply. Then that's considered a metziah. Now the Shach actually brings a Ramban who says, no, we can't start saying even buy a sale if the price is cheap, because that's going to be too complicated. And therefore, in that scenario, not. But the Ramah, either way, passes like Rabbeinu Tam, that there's no issa if something's hard to find. Now, in Sif Beis, in this Simon in Shulchan Aruch, the mechaber quotes the halacha we said earlier regarding a teacher trying to poach the job that another teacher, a rebbe, is currently being employed in. And the mechaber continues with exactly your shaila. However, if one parent is hiring a melamed, another parent, you got one parent sitting at chasta next to you, and he's raving, he's so excited about the rebbe that he hires to teach his child because he finally got a rebbe who, manages to connect to his child, and you're sitting thinking, that's exactly what I'm looking for. Says the mechaber, black and white, no problem. You can go ahead and poach that rebbe. Now, this psak is actually quoted in Tosfos on the Gemara, and the Sma on this halacha explains the reason is because when it comes to a rebbe, basbaras halimud v'iyunoi ein melamdin shovin. When it comes to the ability to express and give over information to a pupil, to a child, no two rabbeim are the same. And this rebbe is considered a catch, something which is hard to find. Now, Nesivus, on this Sma, says, well, hang on a minute. In Sif Aleph, the mechaber quoted both opinions, but he didn't issue a ruling himself. The Ramah did, but the mechaber didn't. And now in the Sif Beis, the mechaber is quoting this halacha without anyone arguing on it. And the Sma is saying the reason for that is because a teacher is like a metziah, a rebbe is like a metziah. Says Nesivus, from here we see that the mechaber in Sif Beis, it's halacha without anyone arguing. That means that's how the mechaber himself also rules. That there's nothing wrong with Oni mehapech doesn't apply when something's a metziah, where you can't find it elsewhere. Now, the Aruch HaShulchan actually gives a different explanation. He says that in shaykh b'zeh mehapech b'charar, the whole concept doesn't apply in the case of chapping a rebbe. The ein zeh dover shebemomon and a dvar mitzvah. You're not taking someone's property, you're taking someone who can teach your son Torah better. Ve'ein hatar mishum dover she'eino motzi. So, to answer your question, Ashkenazim who follow the Ramah would be allowed to poach a melamed or a teacher if the reason why they dafka want this teacher is because he has a particular talent or capability which is hard to find. According to Sefardim, it seems to be a machlokes. The Nesivas and the Pischei Tshuva who paskins like him hold the Mechaber also agree to this. However, the Aruch HaShulchan says that Mechaber is only making an exception when it comes to melamed because it's a dvar mitzvah. So when it comes, for example, to poaching a maths teacher, so maybe this depends on earlier podcasts, chinuch podcasts, of whether teaching chol is also considered dvar mitzvah. But generally speaking, strictly speaking, the Aruch HaShulchan would say that for Sefardim, you'd be able to poach a rebbe, but you wouldn't be able to poach a teacher of chol. Now, I will just caveat all of this. The Shulchan Aruch HaRav and other poskim Rav Moshe brings down that even though it's mutter, it's permitted to poach this rebbe, there is a concept of bal nefesh yachmir. There's a room to be strict, and notwithstanding the fact that it's actually allowed to take a higher moral position and not gazump the other party's rebbe.
It's interesting because in the theory of it being a dvar mitzvah, that would make it sound like there isn't a higher moral ground. That if it's a mitzvah, everyone should be hungry for mitzvahs. That's how I understood that.
So they're speaking generally about the concept of oni mehapech by a metziah. Whether they'd say that even by the halacha base of a rebbe is a good point. I don't know.
Okay, so bottom line, Dayan, what's coming out is that there's absolutely no problem in going over to the best school in town and poaching their rabbeim.
There might be another consideration. In Masechtas Gittin, Daf Nun Tes, the Mishnah says, Oni hamanakif b'reish hazayis. If a poor man wants olives and he climbs up a tree and he shakes the branch and the olives fall off, mashe tachtov gezel nidarki shalom. The olives that fall off, if someone else were to come along and pick up those olives and want to take them home, it's also to do it. It's gezel, but nidarki shalom. It's not regular theft. It's theft in order to keep the peace, so to speak. And Rabbi Yossi argues and says, no, it's gezel gomo. It's proper gezel. And Shulchan Aruch, Siman Shin Ayin, Sif Hey, the Ripaskin, and it's gezel midivrei. It's also midrabanon. Now the question is, what is this new issa? I mean, it's a bit confusing in any case. It sounds very similar. This is called oni hamanakif, and the previous halacha was oni hamehapech. But what is this halacha? Why is it that the Ramah, for example, who paskins that when it comes to things which are hefker, there's no problem of gazumping of oni mehapech, and yet here these olives are clearly hefker, and the Shulchan Aruch is saying that it's asa, and the Ramah doesn't argue. So what are we missing? So in the Shulchan Aruch itself, it doesn't add much light. But the Achronim all come up with different explanations as to what is more severe, what's more serious in the case of Oni Hamanakif. And the common theme between them seems to be that there's a much larger amount of effort that's been exerted by the first person. In the scenario of Hamanakif, he's climbed up a tree and shaken the tree in order to make these olives full, and now you come in, and not just has he done a larger effort, but you're piggybacking the effort that he's done in order to get a free meal, literally. And that combination adds an extra degree of issa. The Pischei Tshuva of Bromsvi Eisenstadt has a sefer printed at the back of the Shulchan Aruch called the Nachlas Tzvi. And in the Nachlas Tzvi, he goes into great depths on this halacha. And he says over a maisa which all of us can relate to. He says there was a town who appointed a Rav who didn't have much expertise, much experience in this area, being Rabbanos. And eventually, he learned on the job, and he became a Rav of stature and prominence, at which point a big city came along, and they wanted to chap him, because now he's roy to be the Rav of a big city. And the town claimed that you can't do that. We put so much effort into this Rav, and we finally got him to this level, and you shouldn't be allowed to take him and gain from all of our hard work. And this should be oni hamanakif, this added issa. And the Marik, who lived in Italy over 500 years ago, wrote that in a similar context, a killer can't poach a rov from another killer, as the first town have invested so much into their rov, and they're going to have to invest so much to find a replacement, and therefore you're not allowed to do that. But the Nachasvi himself seems to understand that the Marik would only have a problem if the first town hadn't really benefited from their labor, as opposed to if they put in all the energy into the rov and then they reap the rewards for a number of years and they had their payback, then even the Marik wouldn't have a problem. But either way, the Nachasvi disagrees with this whole approach. And he says because there's so many different opinions in what Onya Manakif requires, and each of those opinions don't agree with all the other requirements of the other opinions, he says that no, there's no problem. And more than that, when you hire a Rebbe or a Rav, you know he may get an approach from somewhere else. Al Das Kain, with that in mind, you're hiring him, that you know that there's such a risk. So he paskins, for example, then in a modern day scenario that we are more familiar with. So often you have a situation with schools where a school may take a young man out of Kail who's got absolutely no experience in teaching, and they try and train him up to be a Rebbe, and some parents will tell you that their children might be korbanos along the way, the first year or two. And finally he reaches a stage, he's a polished, successful Rebbe. According to Nachasvi, it'd be mutter for another Moisés at that stage to come along and poach him if his capabilities and talents are really hard to find. Having said that, this is purely from a pure halachic perspective. On a practical level, schools might need to operate in a manner that don't rub each other up the wrong way. So it might be conducive for there to be certain rules of engagement in how these things are done. But strictly speaking, Nachasvi says that in most scenarios, it won't be a problem if that Rebbe has unique capabilities.
What's the Dayan suggesting? In an ideal world, schools should have an agreement that we don't approach each other.
I don't think we won't approach each other, but maybe a certain understanding of when one can, when one can't. Let's pick that extreme scenario. Imagine you have a school who's literally poured in resources, maybe paid for him to be trained and all the rest. Now, in some cases, because of this problem, a school will make a member of staff sign that because we're spending so much money on training you, if you leave within the first 5 years, you ask that money back. Or something like that, just to cover themselves. But basically, a school has to ask themselves a question: how would we feel? Like all areas of Yiddishkeit, how would we feel if this was happening to us? But sometimes the marketplace out there for good quality rabbeim and teachers is very lacking, and
so therefore, we call them metziah.
For sure, yeah.
Okay, so we're getting a clearer picture on the rules of Onya mehapech. So going back to our original question, the employee that wants to leave. Are you saying that the klal or the issa of Onya mehapech is the only restraint on the employee being able to take the clients?
That depends on circumstances. The Tosfos, which you mentioned earlier, in Kiddushin, quotes the Gemara in Babasra, Daf Chofalov, where the Gemara tells us, "Marchikim min adag kemoli ritzas adag," which means if you have a fisherman who's sitting downstream and he's spread out his net across the river, and he's hoping to catch the fish as they come downstream, you're not allowed to go up and within close proximity put your net a little bit higher up than his, so that you'll end up getting all the fish that were otherwise going to be coming into his net. Now Tosfos asks, Akasha, according to Rabbeinu Tam, which we quoted earlier, who says when something's hefker, when something isn't owned by anyone, there's no issa of Onya mehapech because you can't say go somewhere else. So why is it forbidden to put your net out higher up? Now, one could answer, because there's plenty of fish in the sea. In other words, one could answer that even though it's true in something's hefker, the issa doesn't apply. The rationale for that is because you can't tell me go elsewhere. But you can tell me, why do you have to put, just to spot that I'm fishing, go, put your net somewhere else in a different river. So I don't know, maybe in time I understood this would apply even if this is the only local river. And by doing this, I'm literally, taking all the fish.
Are they saying it's also, or it's not a nice thing to do?
No, the Gemara says it's also.
Right.
And Tosfos is asking why. According to Rabbeinu Tam, why is it also? Because in his kasha, Tosfos thought it's also because of Onya mehapech. And he's saying, according to Rabbeinu Tam, that shouldn't be a problem because these fish are hefker. No one owns them.
Right. But the thing of there's more fish in the sea, why come to me? That would just be a not nice thing. That wouldn't create an issa. The
distinction, according to Rabbeinu Tam, is when I can tell you go somewhere else, then it's osa, Onya mehapech. where I can't tell you to go somewhere else, then it's not also. Here, Tosfos is asking, according to Rabbeinu Tam, it's apparently also. And why? The Gemara says it's also. According to Rabbeinu Tam, why is also? So I'm just saying, it would seem that you can't say go somewhere else.
Right.
So Tosfos answers in his first answer that in this case, there's a different consideration. This is not just a case of taking a random item that someone else wanted. Rather, this is talking about Yod Lumnosi. This is the fisherman's parnassa, his livelihood, and you're taking it away in a major way. Says Tosfos, this is similar to a specific halacha of psakta lichiyusoi, which is talking about a case where a person has, for example, a shop or a business at the end of a cul-de-sac. Someone's not allowed to open the same type of a shop or business at the entrance to the cul-de-sac in such a way that anyone who wants to go to the original shop will have to walk past the new shop, and there's no point walking all the way down to the end of the cul-de-sac because I've got the business at the entrance, and effectively he'll wipe out his parnassa. Says Tosfos, that's the same problem here. You can't cast your net upstream if that means you're going to take all the fish which the original fisherman was meant to get because you're wiping out his parnassa. So, in the context of our first shaila, if Reuven is running all of Shimon's company, all of the clients know Reuven, to the extent that if Reuven would now leave and open up on his own and approach the clients, it would not be out of the question that they would all move across because they only know Reuven. And they'd leave Shimon's company with no business. They'd effectively wipe out Shimon's business. So then in that scenario, for Reuven to directly again invite the clients to bring their business to the new company might not only be a issa on a mehapech, might also be a issa psakta lichiyusoi, of taking away his whole parnassa. There's one other issa which is mentioned in the Poaching, that's the issa of marufia, which is a specific case where a person's got very, very steady clients, which the Ramah discusses in Simon Kufn and Vav. That's not so. Again, this particular case, many Poaching argue about whether that even applies nowadays at all. But strictly speaking, if you're going to impact his whole parnassa, that's already more serious than on your mehapech.
So that's irrespective of the fact that he is an employee about to be an ex-employee. That would be the
Correct.
same case of a new business opening up in town and effectively targeting all the original business's customers or not.
Well, so the Shulchan Aruch in Simon Kufn and Vav paskins that as long as two people live in a city, the fact that one person opens up a business first doesn't mean the second person isn't allowed to open up a business. Doesn't mean the first one has the rights to have a monopoly. This question gets asked often. You can have a lady opens up a certain type of service or a certain type of business in town, and no one else had done it yet till now. And then someone else comes along and literally sees her idea and thinks, brilliant, I can do that as well. And often the first person might have learned from the mistakes, tried different things. Some things work better, some things work worse. And now the second lady can come along and piggyback on, the first person's experience and just start competing. And is that a problem? Often the first person feels outraged. How can you do this? You're damaging my parnassa. And this is the nukuda. The Pesach Tshuva elaborates that there's only osa for the second person if it's very clear for whatever reason that by the second person opening up, they're going to wipe out the first business. But if all they're going to do is damage the profits of the first business, then, that's the nature of business. If one person opens first, they have the monopoly. They'll always make more business than when they've got competition. That doesn't mean you have a right to the monopoly. Another factor to bear in mind is the benefit of the community. The community also benefit from there not potentially being a monopoly and there being competition. So to answer your question, it depends. People are often very quick to say that the second person is going to wipe out my business. Is it going to wipe out the business, or you just won't make as much money as you've been making till now?
Right.
And that Pesach Tshuva says, if you both live in the same town, you've got the same rights as long as you're not clearly wiping out the business. If, for example, it's a very niche business, which only has a certain small market, and by there isn't enough business for two different people to be doing this, then there's a shaila to be asked.
But I assume the people's fear is not so much that would be wiped out, but rather would completely change the way they're doing business. So let's say if this new business comes along, and that would mean that they would have to drastically downsize, they would have to fire a few employees, and they'd turn into a small operation compared to the town they were serving. You're saying that wouldn't be considered wiping out?
Again, anyone who has a monopoly ends up with a big business, normally. Right? So just think about it. Imagine the first, you have a new town in America, you have this more often. They move out to different areas, and then eventually they have their first kosher food store. And then as the community gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that store might be serving the whole community. And eventually someone might think, hey, we've grown big enough in area and numbers that we can have another store. It's always good to have a second store. I can compare prices, like two shuls, right? So you can't say just because the first one has such a booming business with a monopoly, that means no one else is allowed to open a store.
I understand. But is there ever a case where we say a shop opens next door selling the same thing? It happens in every town, and it's 2 doors away. It's also selling clothes or
there's
whatever.
Sometimes a menschlich shaila asking, did you have to do it right next door?
Right.
Even across the roads, Betzim, it's perfectly mutter. Just sometimes, you ask people, use your common sense. You don't have to rub it in their face. But if someone's from out of town and they want to open in town, that's more complicated. There might be grounds to stop it. And there's a shaila which sometimes gets asked. If a person opens a store in Golders Green, and someone wants to come from Stamford Hill and open up a competing store here, is that called the same town or not? But that's for sure a subject for a different podcast.
Stamford Hill's definitely out of town.
Yeah.
These cases we're discussing, or we've probably branched off a bit, are considered Hasagas gevul, to encroach someone else's boundaries of business. Is the Dayan saying that it's very rare for these rules to actually apply?
Yeah, Hasagas gevul, the original Hasagas gevul, meant if you have a field next to my field and you move the boundary fence into my field, and you're taking a bit of my land. That's the Hasagas gevul that the Torah speaks about. This concept of Hasagas gevul is learned from that you're encroaching into my business. As you said, on a practical level in the world we live in today, where there's different types of people, not just from within our own community, who are competing in any case. You've got supermarkets competing, you've got other businesses, non-Jewish businesses and Jewish businesses. And so it's hard to come up with a proper case of Hasagas gevul. It can sometimes really happen, but it's not common.
Okay, so this issue of the employee leaving and his big debate, does he go for a partnership? Does he leave and try and poach the clients? Does he start again? Does he advertise? And the boss, what he's thinking about the whole thing. Can the Dayan give us some real life examples of what you've dealt with where all these different angles come out?
Yeah, so just before I come to that, actually, I just want to make sure that everyone's clear on the bottom line for this situation. Right? We started with that shaila and what's best for him. So first of all, as we said in summary, a partnership of profits is not really a partnership. So if it's a question of partnership, then you should feel free to try and bring up with the boss about offering him genuine partnership. If he were to leave, as we explained, he would not be allowed to approach the clients. However, he would be allowed to advertise, and if the clients ended up coming to him, then he'd be okay, which is why it's probably a good idea for the boss to actually offer him a proper partnership once he twigs that the original shutzvus wasn't quite what it sounded like. But to answer your question, these situations come up a lot, and I'll speak about one particular scenario which I've seen on a number of occasions, which is much more loaded than just the original question which we had. Let's talk about a father's business. Father's got a business, and he brings in one child, whether it's a son or a son-in-law, and they start working in the business. And he doesn't bring in any other children. And as time progresses, that child ends up taking on more and more responsibilities until eventually gets to a stage that he's a major, or maybe even the major force in the business. And by this stage, he may have grown the company in a major way, revitalized it, sometimes saved it almost from collapse, taken it down a completely different direction. It might be not recognizable, brought in technology, made it evolve with the times. And on paper, the business still belongs to his father or father-in-law or parents-in-law. But in reality, he has taken it to where it is now. And then one day, this son wakes up, or his wife wakes him up, and he asks himself the $1 million question, like, what is my plan? Where am I going with all of this? Because he begins to realize that it's not going to be long before his shver or father retire, and then he's going to be left running the family business. And even if he, as you call it, leverages staying in the business with receiving a percentage of shares, not share profits, genuine shutvas, then there's a risk that the siblings will resent him for leveraging at that stage to get so much of the business, which, of course, from their perspective, leaves their parents with less monthly income and profits to distribute to the rest of them. Furthermore, after 120, when the father or share passes, then all of a sudden he finds himself a partner with all of the Yosemim, all of his siblings or siblings-in-law, with all the complications that come with that. At that stage, if he were to decide to leave the company and open up on his own, his father's business would probably collapse and his family will never forgive him. So, especially if the clients move over to him, even without him poaching them, he didn't poach them, didn't do anything wrong, he's heard this podcast, he's done everything by the book, and they see his adverts and they move over and there's no issa whatsoever, but practically his family will look at him that he ripped off the whole family. And this is a common situation, and there aren't necessarily any easy fixes for it. What would be maybe a starting position is if people hear this and realize that it's not black and white, because the siblings normally have a very clear opinion from their perspective, which often they're only really looking at half the picture. They're not valuing how much their brother or shwager has improved the business. They're not understanding potentially that if he would have walked away and never worked in the business, he might have had a business this size by now himself, which he'd own 100%. So there are a lot of angles there which, before it falls into all-out war, machlekes, not talking to each other, and all that goes with it, it's worth understanding this is a complex situation which, at the beginning, sounds so straightforward. Who doesn't want to bring in a child into their business? What could go wrong? And this is not talking about when the boss is only a shutuf and he's got his partner's children as well and all the complications that come with that.
Well, you're definitely describing a very common scenario, because who doesn't want to, like you said, who doesn't want to bring a son or son-in-law into the business? Generally, what would the Dayan advise a father who comes to him? His son's moving back. He's got a bunch of other sons or sons-in-law that are learning, and this is the son that would, and he's worried. And he comes to Dayan and he goes, well, I'm going to take my son, but I've heard the podcast, or I'm just thinking about the future. How does one guide such a father?
I know you don't like when I say this, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. It really depends on the nuance. In some cases, he needs to bring in the child because he wants the business to keep going and he's worried that he's running out of steam and he needs an extra pair of hands. In some cases, he's doing it just because he wants to help his child have a parnassa. So if it's the latter, then all these questions, can maybe bear that in mind. This easy fix isn't necessarily the best fix. But if it's the first and he's worried about the business, he wants an extra young, energetic person, then maybe it's worth having that conversation with the other children at the beginning. That, I want to bring him in, but I know it can be complicated to bring him in. Now, a lot of people don't want to do this because they don't want to fend for themselves their children. They don't think that it's their children's business and whatever they decide. But often they don't decide. They do it with no machshava whatsoever, and then things evolve, like we said before, and that's a shame. So it needs to be done with thought, and if one sees that this child, not just because he's the son of the boss, but because he's actually really helping the business, then you may end up giving him shares along the way, and it may get to a situation where you give him the right to buy you out when you retire, potentially. But it really depends on so many different angles involved.
Probably needs an episode in itself to cover all these angles and how it works with inheritance and how it's even possible for children to inherit equally a business that one child is fully running.
I've come across cases where children worked for a salary in the father's business all the years on the assumption that they could have got paid much more, they would have gone elsewhere, but in this assumed or presumed assumption that business is obviously going to be left to them, and then when it wasn't, they felt really cheated and they felt robbed, and this makes no sense. Why would I have stayed on that salary all these years? I always told my wife when she brought it up that because one day he's going to leave it to us, and now what am I going to tell my wife? These are the questions people ask. Fathers need to think through these things and the complications and the angles. A lot of children, as we discussed in the earlier podcast, don't want to and shouldn't necessarily challenge parents. But at the same time, one has to be very sanoided. One has to think before, how's this going to work? What's the plan? And as I sometimes tell people, when the best case scenario doesn't look that rosy, then you need to think whether this is the correct mahalach.
Is it appropriate for children to ask their parents that question?
A child who's going to go and work for his parent, for his father, is not the same as a child questioning their parents' hanhaga. This is their parents' behavior. This is a child coming into work and without falling foul of the original Yahweh Melech Chodosh and being ungrateful. It's important. The Chofetz Chaim says anytime there's any financial agreement between parties, you need to spell it out properly and put it in writing, because otherwise you run the risk that there'll be these perceived, implied, I thought, on different pages, and mistakes can happen and breaks can happen. People can have tainas. So I don't think there's anything wrong at all with a son coming in and saying, but can I understand how this is meant to work? But at the same time, when you start on ground zero, and the only yichus you have is that you're the son of the boss, but you don't necessarily even know if you're good for the business, not good for the business. So of course you're not going to become a shareholder, and so you have to earn it, you have to work your way up. But at the same time, there needs to be some kind of understanding of what the plan is. And that might have to get reviewed.
Well, that's been a very fascinating episode. We've certainly covered a lot of different angles. It's been somewhat of a sugya, but kept very relevant and practical. So just as a closing question, if listeners can just take away one principle when they're pursuing opportunities, they're growing a business, or they're competing with others, what lessons could we learn from Onia mehapech, Hasagas, gevul, all the other halachic terminology and rules that we've mentioned today? What would you want our listeners to take away?
I think that people, when they're in these situations, often forget because they're caught up in it all and they're trying to earn a parnassa, and that's not so easy, and under pressures and strains, and especially if they're trying to keep up with what they think the Joneses are. Then remember, the Gemara says the first kasha which a person gets asked after 120 when they die is nasata be'emunah. Did you conduct your business affairs honestly and ethically? It's interesting that the words used is be'emunah. It doesn't say nasata be'yosha, be'emunah. And this is posha. I haven't seen it anywhere, but it's posha pshat in the Gemara, that if when a person's doing their business affairs, they think about emunah and bitachon and the fact that parnassa is from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then why would I steal? Because I'm not going to gain by stealing, because I'm going to end up with whatever I'm meant to end up with in any case. And the same goes with gazumping, and the same goes with all these other things. If a person has proper emunah and bitachon and reminds himself, and it's a constant avodah to remind oneself, and anyone who's out in the business world knows that they see every day lessons in emunah and bitachon and the Yad Hashem, and how a person putting in the effort in one area, they're startless one place, and all of a sudden they get mom and Hashemayim in a different place. And I've been told, I think I was told by my father many years ago and by many businessmen since, that they don't need to open a Musa Sefer. They see the Yad Hashem in the office on a regular basis. Again, not saying one shouldn't open a Musa Sefer, but the point is that these halachos are all about not treading on other people on your way up. The realizing that what I'm meant to get, I get. I have to do my shtadlus, but that's all it is. It's a shtadlus. If you recognize all it is a shtadlus, then I can do my shtadlus by the book, because surely doing my shtadlus not by the book is not going to make me end up with a better parnassa.
Do you think maybe that's why it's one of the first questions asked? Because parnassa is such a prevalent part of a person's life, and it's relevant to every single day in a person's life in business, whether they're employed, whether they're an employer. And it's a day-to-day. There's so many different aspects of getting one's livelihood that one person can either think, this is in my hands, or do inappropriate shtadlus, or just do the shtadlus necessary and leave the rest to Hashem. It's such a huge part of our lives.
It's a huge part of our lives. Again, I can't answer whether that is what puts that question before the other very, very important parts of our lives as well. And in our Torah, our Torah mitzvahs governs every moment of our lives. But it's a huge part of our life. Maybe it's just worth adding a twist, because the Gemara tells us that the second question which we get asked is kavata itim Torah. Did we have a fixed time when we learned every day? And Taisus brings down that there's a different Gemara which tells us that the first thing a person gets punished for is if they didn't learn in the appropriate manner. And Tosfos asks, well, this seems to be a contradiction, because you say the first question you get asked is, did you conduct your business affairs honestly? And the second question is, did you learn in the appropriate manner? But when it comes to getting punished, we get punished first for learning. So Tosfos in his first teretz says that actually, the first question we get asked is nasata emunah. Second question is when it comes to punishing us, if we didn't have our learning done properly, then we get punished for that first. So a pun, asked, well then, either way, if the first thing we're going to get punished for is for not learning properly, then why isn't that the first question which we're asked? And vice versa. What's going on? So he brilliantly says that the first thing HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to know is nasata b'emunah. Did we conduct our business affairs honestly with emunah, as we've said? The second thing he wants to know is, did you learn properly? But normally, the reason why a person might not be able to answer correctly nasata b'emunah is because he didn't learn the halachos which were relevant to him. And therefore, when it comes to punishing us, we get punished for not learning those halachos properly, not listening to the right shiurim and podcasts, and making ourselves aware that famously the Gedolim used to tell their children that, if you want to go to work, then you have to understand that, like there's a Shulchan Aruch that governs us in how we're meant to daven, there's a Shulchan Aruch that governs us in how we eat and what brachos we make, and there's a Shulchan Aruch that tells us what to do and what not to do on Shabbos. There's a Shulchan Aruch that tells us what to do in the office. There is this figurative image of a person taking his couple off when he walks into his office, so to speak. He was so Salanta, we had the person who came to him, and he was a sheikhet, and he wanted to stop being a sheikhet, and he asked him, why do you want to stop being a sheikhet? He said, because I'm so worried about the huge pressure on me. If I get anything wrong, then chas v'shalom, that I'm causing treif. So he said, so what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to open a shop. So he said, well, do you know how many different isurim that can happen in a shop if your weights aren't right and everything? So this concept of, this is my Torah life, this is my Yiddish life, and now I'm in the office. No, it's 24/7, every part of our day. And adrabah, when a person's in the office, then there's the added element of the opportunity to make a kiddush Hashem in everything that we do. And chas v'shalom faket.
Yep, and like you said, to be kaveh itim by listening to the podcast. Nowadays, it's never been easier. Many people have told us that. Right, yeah. But many people have told us that they listen on their commutes, when they exercise, and in all other areas of their life where they wouldn't necessarily be able to open a sefer. So we might have to bring a podcast every day to be mezakeh the rabbeim. Thank you very much, Dayan Posen. It was a fascinating episode.
Thank you.
This is our first on Choshen Mishpat. I have no doubt that we'll be getting a lot of questions and also future topic suggestions for any other areas that people would like discussed in their business lives. Please send to podcast@federation.org.uk or alternatively anonymously via the form online. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you.